Hey guys, how's it going? I hope you're all doing great, as I always say, following the 3 H's of the channel and all that good stuff. And in this video, there's a pretty wild variety in this one. We have things that happen to a security guard who's working night shift at a mental hospital. There's Northern Illinois, where they experience something on an old military base, and people in the trees in Texas. If this sounds like something that you're interested in, definitely pull up a stump with me. Let's jump into it. Thank you for watching. This happened in Northern Illinois. We drove out to this prairie farmland to explore these old abandoned military arsenal buildings. There was not a whole lot but flat grassland and scattered clumps of trees for miles around. It was a clear but moonless night. We had to climb over a 10-foot fence just to get in. There were numerous sheds that dotted the landscape. All of them were covered in sod to prevent satellite detection. There was no sound but the wind. There were some coyotes howling in the distance, and a highway even further away. We explored a few of them. Most of them were just filled with rusted and twisted machinery, probably junk sheds. But then we find this long building. We're walking down a long hallway. The ceiling is caved in, and there's rot everywhere. Suddenly, a girl in our group screams. She points to an old room that has a window to it. The window is missing. There's a black shape that perches on something in the room. There's an explosive flash of wings as it flies out the window. It was absolutely huge, but in the moment, we decided it would be better if we just said it was a turkey vulture and just kind of laughed it off. But I don't think any of us believed it was. I wander out on my own after we all go back outside. I'm going down this old overgrown road, and I begin to feel very uneasy. The howling of coyotes suddenly wasn't so far off, and it felt like it was right next to me. I had a panoramic view of the prairie, and I was looking toward a grove of trees far to my right. Something about it didn't look right. As I'm staring at it, this tall, black shape disappears behind one of the trees. What I thought was part of a tree seemed to be something that was almost 10 feet tall and thin. It had scraggly, long arms. I book it back to my friends. I don't mention that I saw this. I'm super on edge after this. This is only cemented by the fact that the next shed that we looked into smelled like death and had animal bones strewn all across the rotted out floor. None of my other friends mentioned noticing anything, but when we were exploring some of the other sheds, I noticed that that thing that I had seen earlier would be watching us from far away. We ended up leaving shortly after because one of the girls had put their foot through the floor and twisted their ankle. The thing just stayed right near the trees and watched us, almost like it was curious about us. Shortly after this, I moved out of that town, but I'm back there now. I'd like to go camping there, or just go there with some people to see if it's still there, or if anything happens. I pulled a few weeks of night shift as part of a maintenance crew for a mental hospital. That, in and of itself, is really creepy. The patients there weren't simply your run-of-the-mill adolescents with depression issues who did stuff for attention and got locked up for 3 days or so. Some of these people were absolutely psychotic. Normally, I did electrical work for various businesses and other places around town within the company. And then the time came when we got hired out for this place for a time. And good lord, some of the weirdest stuff ever happened to me. At night, this place was locked down, basically like a prison, pretty much. For good reason, obviously, but there were times where the power would go out and I had to get it back up and running, and I can tell you, it is a bad feeling when you're having to trust the light of your torch in pitch blackness in a building mainly full of people who can easily kill you in seconds. I remember one night in particular when the power went down. I was sitting in the maintenance shop. We had an actual shop because this place was that big, and out of nowhere, the lights just blank out, and I'm in pitch black darkness. I had been sitting by myself in there, just doing nothing, waiting for a call on the radio for something that needed fixing. Out of nowhere, my radio starts going off, belching and squealing noises, static, even though it was on the correct frequency. I hear a loud crash from the other side of the shop. I'm holding my flashlight in a death grip now. At this point, I'm about ready to kill the first person who wanted to come at me. This wasn't a place to screw around in. I shine my light in the direction of the crash, and a large tool chest had been flipped over. It was the kind you'd find in a mechanic's garage, the big reddish-orange chests. It was knocked over completely, and all the tools were lying all over the floor. At this point, I started hearing a metallic dragging sound across the shop floor, and that was enough for me. I left the area. I could barely see where the hell I was going, but I managed to get to the exit door, and I just flew out of there, basically. Mind you, I haven't said a word at this point aside from the instinctual "what the hell" and such, but certainly nothing over my radio. I didn't even take it with me. I was in such a hurry to get out of there. I booked it to the main building, as just another member of the crew had managed to reset the breaker and bring the lights back on. Our supervisor and the other members of the team are waiting in a lobby area. I run up to them, apologizing for being late. My boss tells me no biggie, he just talked to me over the radio moments before I got there. That was impossible. I didn't bring it with me. And then I started to freak out when it became clear that I wasn't the only person who was in the shop at the time. After trying to calm myself down while telling this to my boss at the time, they initiate a security lockdown and send the big goon squad guys over to the shop. The entire place was locked down tight, and we couldn't even go back in there until it was completely secure. Eventually, they come back. They found nothing. No evidence that anyone else was ever in there, and every patient was accounted for in their rooms. I didn't sleep well after that, as you can imagine, and it wasn't the only weird thing to ever happen to me there. That tool chest was solid, and it couldn't have just fallen over on its own, with a very noticeable seismic activity going on, or with someone pushing a very serious amount of force behind them. When that thing hit the ground, it sounded like the Hulk shoved it down a flight of stairs, and they found nothing. I'm honestly never going to forget that anytime soon. That's a feeling that doesn't really leave you. But that wasn't the craziest or creepiest thing that happened to me there. On another night that I had to work, a few doctors had transferred offices from one side of the facility to the main building. These offices are pretty far out from it, and for the first couple of hours my shift consisted of nothing else but helping to lift and move heavy-ass metal and oak desks to our flatbed, and the rest of the crew handled setting them up in their respective offices. About 4 hours in, and all that stuff had been moved, and I was the last person over there. I was packing up computers to move because these offices were no longer going to be used. They were built in the mid-70s and were old, moldy, and gross. If you know architectural stereotypes from the time, you should have a good idea of how these buildings looked on the inside, aesthetic-wise. The problem I had with them was that they were really cramped, like claustrophobically so. I couldn't imagine why somebody would design a set of offices like this. Getting the desks out was a serious pain in the ass on its own, but feeling like you weren't in a sardine can was impossible. The entire place also felt ridiculously out of date from the rest of the entire facility, like it was just stuck in time. The emptiness didn't help that at all either. As I was packing up the last of the computers into a box, I was about to carry it to my truck to take it to the main building. I look over my right shoulder and down a brief corridor as I wipe sweat off my brow, and I'm staring right at a child, no older than 6, wearing a typical patient smock. This made me nearly crap my pants for a few reasons. 1, I had huge doubts that any children had ever been admitted to this place in the past. 2, I had huge doubts there ever were children here. This was a place for the condemned, practically, not a place of healing. Another reason that this made me almost poop my pants was that I looked away and looked back, and he was still there. He was about 6 years old, messy brown hair, greenish eyes. He started laughing at me in a typical way of a horror movie, and then ran down a corridor to his left. Like an idiot, I decided to follow him. I'm already freaking out that I just saw that, and this location was too far from the main building for any of the patients to have realistically gotten out without setting off alarms or security lockdowns. I get to the corridor that he took off down, and as you'd expect, nothing. I decide to check out the one behind me just in case. As I got halfway down it, I come to a set of metal double doors. It was bizarre enough that this hallway seemed more fitting for a preschool, but weirder, there were even double doors in it. As I got right up to them, mind you the lights were on, it was well lit and bright in this entire place. The door slammed shut, hard, catching my left hand right in it. I felt a flash of pain go all the way up to my shoulder, and then nothing. My whole arm felt like it went instantly numb after that. I didn't know it at the time, but I had broken almost every knuckle in my left hand. The door flung back open and smashed the wall so hard the push door on it came right off and clanged against the floor. And at the end of the corridor, I see the kid once again. He's standing at the very end of the hallway and walks into a different office that we had cleared a few pieces of equipment out of earlier, and its door slams. It slams so hard that the pane of glass in the window shatters. Remember, this was all in bright light, no super spooky grim darkness. I saw all of this stuff plain as day, and there was no mistaking at all what I had seen. I swear to God, this actually happened. This was the last event I'd experienced there, because after this I abruptly quit the company and started working in a totally different field. I had taken this other position while I was in college as a cheap summer job. As you can imagine, I left the building, told my boss that he can get the rest of the equipment in there himself, and quit. I drove to an urgent care place nearby because, like hell, am I going to trust the doctors in a mental ward after I'd just gone on a ramble about ghost kids or whatever that crushed my hand with the metal door? that wouldn't have gone well, and I found out that I hairline fractured nearly every bone in my hand and cracked 2 of my knuckles, my ring and index fingers. I did a bit of researching on the place after that, whilst collecting a bit of workman's compensation for my hand. I needed 2 surgeries on it to get it back in proper working order, and discovered that there was unfortunately a lot of child murderers there who managed to convince the jury of an insanity plea that had been locked up there. A few of them made BTK look like a choir boy. This whole thing didn't settle well with me because at the time I was very religious, and this event directly had an effect on my faith. I felt awful, and it felt wrong that God could trap a child's soul in this place, and it seemed to be stuck there for eternity. And I don't know. If you can't tell, I've never really gotten over these incidents. This is something that happened to my family. This took place in the early 1980s, way before I was born. I heard it from my cousin, who confessed the whole thing to me while he was telling me other stuff. Bear with me. I don't know what was encountered out there. I don't really have any clear idea other than what I was told. Anyways, here we go. My family used to own several acres of mountain in South Texas. Not Rocky Mountain kind of mountains, but a nice little size and area. No more than a couple 100 feet above land. It was beautiful, apparently, a very lovely piece of property. It'd be worth a lot of money now, had the family not sold it years later for no clear reason other than that they wanted money. My father and uncles built a cabin on the property over several years during the 60s and 70s. It had rudimentary plumbing and electricity, as best as you could get, being miles away from civilization. The family tried getting there to vacation a couple times a year, but with the men all being truck drivers on the road for long hours, their schedules rarely synced. They went when they went, pretty much. The area was surrounded by some forests and had some critters and wildlife, but there were no spooky legends or anything of the sort associated with it, and my family had visited the area on a regular basis. They didn't really encounter anyone outside of one time some campers who were usually at the bottom of the mountains, and one time there was a hunter, maybe 2. Most of their vacation was spent with the cousins, being children, playing and hanging out. The women, my aunts, gossiped and cooked, and the men, my uncles, usually a couple older male cousins as well, sat back and drank. Your typical Mexican-American family. One particular evening, however, this all changed. It was my eldest uncle, his son, who was an adult, our other cousins, and 2 of my aunts. They did what I described in my first part. The men outside drinking, the kids inside or outside playing, and the women doing their thing. Suddenly, they hear a woman scream. It surprised the hell out of my uncle and my cousin. They were genuinely concerned when they heard it again, that some camper or somebody may have strayed too far from wherever it is that they were camping from or coming from, and they got seriously hurt trying to climb the rocky terrain on a moonless night. So they take their flashlights and charge forward. When they go into the forest area, the screaming stops. My uncle yells out, asking if somebody needs help. The person didn't respond. My cousin shined his light over an area. When it passed, the screaming started again. Only this time, the scream wasn't as far away. It was closer. To them, it sounded like a woman being murdered or something like that. It was just a terrible scream. Their first idea was, let's go back to the cabin and get our shotguns. When they started walking away, though, they heard a second scream accompany the first one, except this scream was closer and came at them from the side. They thought they saw someone move in the forest too, but whatever it was too fast for their light. So they run back to the cabin, and by then there was a third and fourth individual scream coming about. The women and children are obviously freaking out. Everyone is. They ask what it is, and the men have no idea. They lock the doors, load their shotguns, and wait. Now, the easiest thing that they could have done was haul ass in the car when it started, except this was a moonless night, and the way down was very tricky, especially at night, on a mountain and a paveless road. And this being the early 80s, there were no cell phones or GPS or anything of that sort available to a blue-collar family. They were going to have to wait it out. My aunt begins to pray. The kids are quiet. My uncle and cousin take watch on different sides of the cabin. By the time 30 minutes had passed, they heard something around the number of 20 different screams, all bellowing at once in some demented symphony. They tried looking in the forest through the windows to catch a look of somebody, anybody, but they couldn't see anyone. Well, they couldn't see anyone at the edge of the forest, with it being so close. They kept questioning where the hell it was coming from. They wondered this until they stopped looking at the actual forest and looked up into the trees. That's when they saw them. Standing on the branches were beings that looked like people, moving up and down, jumping from tree to tree. They almost blended in with the night, with the trees and the leaves themselves. Little light reflections sometimes shined off of their eyes, even when no light passed over them, and despite it being completely dark outside. My uncle got fed up with this. Despite being religious and afraid, he wasn't going to take this torment. He opened the door once, fired his shotgun into the air. The sound roared, and it momentarily silenced the screaming things that were dancing on the trees. He yelled at them in both English and Spanish for them to leave them the hell alone before closing the door and barring it. The sudden silence was a brief respite. The people in the trees vanished, quotes, but they were still there. They knew they were there. My family basically waited the whole night, in absolute terror. Every now and then, you'd hear the same scream, the same sound, but it would be from varying distances, sometimes right by the window, sometimes up in the trees. Every few hours, one of these things would test their limits, and then would come down out of the trees and bang on the walls of the cabin or on the roof, trying to draw them out. They didn't move. They stayed in the cabin all night. At the first crack of dawn, my uncle undid the bar on the door, got everybody out and into the car. My uncle took one last look around and apparently noticed that they were all still up in the trees, but they were just staring. The things didn't follow them whenever they drove away. My uncles did go back out to the area, but again, nothing happened. It was just that one time. My family kept the land until the 90s, right around the time I was born. That's when I sold it. So, what'd you think of those? Let me know which one was your favorite one down in the comments. Do you have one of your own? I have an email in the description below that you can send them to if you'd like to. Down there as well is a PayPal and a Patreon if you would like to support the channel that way. But don't forget that just watching, liking, subscribing, commenting is really good too. And with that, I hope you have a good rest of your week, and happy Canadian Thanksgiving. And thank you for pulling up a stump, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.